Hey everyone, welcome to Studio Review. It's Kyle. In this video, we're going to be covering counting characters. The goals of this studio are to get acquainted with maps, lists, and arrays, those different types of data structures within Java. Then also, we're going to investigate how to manipulate strings and character and utilize these in our applications. To begin, the studio asks us to create a new project called Counting Characters Studio. So let's do this now. As always, we come up here and press New Project. Make sure Java's selected, press next once more, and then we're going to type in Counting Characters Studio. Press finish, and we started our project. Next, we're going to create our first class. I'm going to call this Character Counter. So we go to the source file, right click, New, Java class, and like I said, I'm going to call this Character Counter. Press enter, and our class has been created. As always, we need to keep those three things in mind when we're creating our classes, always declaring those class variables at the top, then our constructors, and then our methods. We have no class variables yet, so that will stay blank. Now we go to our constructors. As of right now, looking at our assignment, it doesn't mention anything that we need to place into our constructor. So I'm just going to build an empty one using the keyword public, character counter, and empty parentheses, and then empty brackets. Now that our class is created, let's go ahead and build that first method, which I'm going to call count characters. That's going to take in a parameter, which is going to be the word that we're going to count the characters of, as a string. So let's do this. We said we're going to call this count characters. We also know we might access this outside of the class. So I'm going to say public, so it's accessible. As of right now, we're only going to print the results to the screen. We're not going to return anything from this method. Therefore, since we're not going to return anything, we put the keyword void, and then we put the name of our method, count characters. Then we said we were going to take a string in as a parameter, so we place string, and I'm going to call it word to count. Now that we've created this class successfully with our constructor and our first method in here, we always need to have a starting point for our Java applications to begin from. In our last studio, we created our main method, that starting point, inside of our class. Though that is acceptable, as our applications become more complex, we might lose track of exactly where that starting point is or where we placed our main method. Therefore, it's a good practice to put your main method inside of a class all by itself, so you know exactly where it is when you want to start your Java application. To do that, we're going to go to the source folder, right-click, press New, and create a new Java class. And what we're going to call it is main. This main class is going to contain our main method, which again is that starting point we need in Java. So then we create it here. We see that once we create this method, we get this green button here so we can run our Java application. Additionally, I'm going to create an instance of the character counter class here and call to the count characters method to see if everything's wired up properly. We then use this new instance of character counter called myCharacterCounter to call to the count characters method, parentheses, and then we're going to just type in a practice word, my practice string. You run this, it will build, and we shouldn't see any output come back because we haven't put anything into this count characters method. We see our process is finished with no output, exactly what we wanted to see. So let's quickly review strings. We have an example here called my string that's wrapped in double quotes to represent that it is a string. One thing we know about this is that they're made up of characters. My string is composed of the capital M character, the lowercase y character, the space character, the lowercase s character, and so forth. These characters together build a string. So if we wanted to break apart this string and investigate each character individually, we have to tell Java that we want to separate our string into its individual characters. To do this, we have to take our string variable, in this case a string, and separate it into a character array. So we do a string.toChar array. That creates a character array. So now we can use this to count each character inside of the string that's given to us. So like we just reviewed, we need to turn this word to count into an array of characters. First, we need to create a variable to contain all of these characters that are going to be coming from word to count. We know it's going to be a character, so we use char. Then it's going to be an array, so we use those open and close square brackets. Then the name of our variable, which I'm going to call array of chars. Set that equal to word to count dot toChar array, which again is going to split word to count into all of its individual characters. So to make sure this works, we're going to print out just the 0th index of the array of characters. Remember, in our example, we're passing my practice string into count characters when we run our Java application. Therefore, when we run it, word to count will be my practice string. The 0th character of my practice string should be a capital M. So we should see a capital M printed out to our terminal. Let's run it. Perfect, exactly what we want to see. Now what we want to do is loop through each of these characters so we can count them. If we think to ourselves, what's the best way to loop through an array? We typically come up with the for loop. So that being said, I'm going to create a for loop here, create I starting at index 0, and then the next parameter in our for loop is tell it when to terminate. I'm going to say at the length of array of characters array. And then what do we do between each iteration? I'm going to increment I, so we say I plus a plus. So now this for loop will loop through each index of our array of characters. So to make sure this is working, let's print out our array of characters at every single index. So what we should see here is my practice string, but every character printed on its own line. So let's go ahead and run this. And that's exactly what we see. Perfect. We know that this loop is working properly. So let's go ahead and continue. Now that we have our loop investigating each individual character, we have to think about which data structure that we need to store our count in. We have 3 to choose from: array, array list, and hash map. The first we're going to investigate is array. We know an array to be a storage device that has a set amount of containers that we can put things into. In our studio, we need something that can contain the count of each character that we've seen inside of a string. Now we know that in the English language, we have 26 letters. So hypothetically, we could create an array of 26, but don't forget those characters can be capital as well. So that means lowercase a and uppercase a are not the same. So we wouldn't have 26 letters there, but we would have then 52. But let's talk about numbers. Those are also characters, 0 to 9. So that's 10 more. Now we're up to 62. And don't forget there's also special characters like the exclamation point, the @ symbol, the hashtag, not to mention Chinese characters, other languages. There's a lot of characters out there that a user could input in our strings. So numerous, we can't tell this array exactly how many characters we're going to see in this string. We don't want to initialize an array of 1,000 characters if we're only going to see A, B, and C. So therefore, this is not going to be the best data structure to store our counts in. So let's take a look at its close cousin, the array list. An array list is a lot like an array, but with one big difference. An array list doesn't need to be set to a specific size. We can have our array list grow and shrink depending on its necessity. Again, we didn't know how many characters we're going to see in this string, whether it's going to be 5 or it's going to be 1,000. So an array list allows us to grow and shrink our list depending on what we need. So the next big thing that we need this data structure to do is store the characters, but as well as our count. Our array list can only store one thing in each slot. It can only store our characters in the example that we see here. So what we would need is an additional array list to store our count, which would be an array list of integers. So now that we have 2 array lists, what we could do is that if we were given the example my string again, we can loop through this and take each character as it comes, stored in our characters array list, and then store the count inside of our character counts array list. So we would take the capital M and we would place 1 inside of our character counts. And same with lowercase y and so on. This is one possible way that we could approach this problem. However, a con to this approach is that now we have to manage 2 different array lists. We have to make sure that we find our character in the array list, and then we have to make sure we update the correct index inside of our character counts array list. So wouldn't life be a lot easier if we could just have one single data structure that does all the counting and character collection for us? So let's take a look at hash map. A hash map is a lot like an object. It stores keys and it stores values. What if we placed our character as that key and our integer as that value, and we called it our character map? If we did this with the example my string once more, our character map would hold that capital M as the key and then have 1 as its value because we've seen M once. We go through our loop once more, we take in that lowercase y, we set that equal to 1 here, and then so on. This makes life for us a lot easier because we don't have to have 2 or more variables keeping track of our counts for our characters. We can store the characters and the counts within one single variable. So therefore, the data structure that I'm going to store the counts in this studio is a hash map. So I'm going to create that now. A hash map takes in 2 different parameters within its pointy brackets. The first one is the key, which will be a character, and the second one is going to be the count, or the integer. I'm going to call it my character count. I'm going to set it equal to a new hash map. Perfect. So in our direction, it says we need to initialize our data structure, in this case our hash map, some time while running this application. So the question is, should we initialize it before we loop or while we loop? We know we need to initialize this hash map for every time we see a new character. So before we loop, we don't actually know what characters are in our string. It would make it a lot easier on us if we just initialized our hash map every time we saw a new character. So in this case, I'm going to choose while we loop. Now what we know to do is that in here, we need to add or update the count for each character that we see into the hash map. But when do we initialize it? We only initialize it in the hash map if we're looking at a character that the hash map has not seen before. It doesn't have the key or the character inside of it. So first, let's create a variable to contain the character that we're looking at. We'll call it the character. We'll get it out at index I. And what we need to do is look and see if this character exists inside the hash map. So how we do that is we say if my character count contains the key, the character. We'll say if it equals false, which means it does not contain the key. If it does not contain the key, then we need to add it and initialize it to 1. So we need to add it to the hash map, which we use the method put. Put takes in 2 parameters, which the first one is the key, which we know is the character, and then our integer value, which again we initialize to 1 because we've seen it once already. Perfect. We are now initializing our hash map. So now the next thing is, what if it has the key inside of it? What if contains key is actually true and not false? Well, that means we need an else statement. And in here, it does contain the key. So if it does contain the key, we need to update the integer value of our hash map. So we can get the integer from the hash map. And how we do that is we say myCharacterCount.get, and then we place the key that we want to get the value of. In this case, it's going to be the character once more, because we want to get the value of this character. Then we increment the value. Now we update the value of the character in the hash map the same way we added it, which is myCharacterCount.put the character, and then we provide the updated value, which is the variable, the value. So there we go. Now we're updating the character's value in the hash map. Let's go ahead and print out our hash map to make sure everything's working. We run it, and we see we get back this object, which again is the map. We see that our spaces, that's what's here, is equal to 2. We've seen 1A, 2 C's, 1 E, and so forth. Looking at my practice string, I see 2 spaces, I see 1A, I see 2 C's, so it looks like this hash map is working properly. So let's move forward. So finally, what the assignment wanted us to do was to print out all these results a little bit more pretty. For example, they wanted the key on the left-hand side, then a colon, and then the number of how many times that character has been counted. So we're going to loop through each of the keys and print out its corresponding value in the format that our assignment wants. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's get all of the keys in one place. I'm going to create an array list of all of our keys using the key set. How we can do that is create an array list. I know all my keys are going to be characters. I'm going to call it my character keys and say new array list. And then I'm going to do something weird. I'm going to put in this key set into these parentheses from the hash map. The hash map is my character count dot key set. What this is doing is that it's getting back a set, which is a different kind of data structure from the hash map. And when we put it into these parentheses, it's going to convert it into an array list. I'm going to quickly import array list. And there we go. Just to make sure that I'm not crazy, we're going to print out my character keys and see if that we're actually getting back the keys that we need. Run it. We see that we're getting back all of the characters that we have seen inside of that string. Perfect. Like we said, we're going to create a for loop. So we say for int I equals 0, I less than my character keys dot size I plus plus. We always check ourselves every step of the way. So we're going to say my character keys index I and print out each character to make sure that what we have is working. Perfect. We see a character on every single line, so we know that this is working. Now let's go ahead and print out what our assignment wants to see. So before we can do that, we need to get the value from the hash map. I know my values are always going to be integers. I'm going to again call it the value, call it to the hash map, dot get. Then we're going to get the value using the key stored in my character keys array list. So we say my character keys dot get at that index I. Perfect. Then we do a system dot out print line. And then we type in the key first. It wants the key on the left-hand side. So we say my character keys, get the key at the specific index. Say plus because we want to append to the string. that colon, and then adding the value. So we put the variable, the value here, then semicolon, and let's run this. Now that we see we're getting back that proper format that our assignment wants. To double check, I'm going to copy the string that it gives as an example, a quote from Hidden Figures, and I'm going to paste that into my parameter here in our main method, and I'm going to run it. Now my output is exactly like I see it inside of the studio. And there we go, everyone. We finished the studio. Awesome job. We have gone over different data structures. We've reviewed how to manipulate strings, and I really do hope this helps. Feel free to stick around for our bonus missions as well as the super bonus. All right, on to the bonus missions. Our first task was to modify a few things about our application. The first being, prompt the user to enter a word to count. This means we're going to ask the user specifically for a string that they would like us to count. That's no problem. We've done that before. We know that if we need to prompt the user for something, we need to use the scanner. And so I'm going to create another method to prompt the user for input. So to do that, I'm going to say public. I'm going to return a string here since we're going to return a string from the user. And I'm going to call it get user input, which is not going to take in any parameters. As always, again, we take in user input using the scanner class. And we always do system.in and then finish. We then have to ask the user for input. So we first create a variable to contain that input, which is going to be a string, my user's input. We're going to call it to the myScanner class and say next line, meaning the next line that the user puts in, no matter what it is, and they press enter, capture that and return it back to me and store it inside of my user's input. Next, we have to close the scanner once we're done with it. So we say myScanner.close. And then finally, we return my user's input. And let's go back to our main and implement it. Here, we need to use that new method that we just created. And remember, it returns a string, so we also need to create a variable to contain what's returned from that method. That's going to capture the user's input. So I'm going to say my user's input. I'm going to say my character counter dot get user input. And now I'm going to replace this long string that we placed in our previous example with that variable, which is my user's input. Perfect. Let's go ahead and run this. So we see that the terminal is stopped and waiting for us because it's waiting for us to provide an input. I, again, am going to provide that string that we get from our assignment and press enter. And we see that our output is exactly like we had it before. The second thing we need to do to make the character counts case insensitive. So what does this exactly mean? It means to have the case of the letters not matter. For example, my string lowercase, if it is case sensitive, it would not match my string uppercase. So how do we make my string lowercase and my string uppercase equal each other, aka case insensitive? We have to make them the same case. So to do this, we set it to a variable and we say a string dot to lowercase to convert my string all to lowercase. Or you might have already guessed, to do it to uppercase, we do the same exact thing, but we say to uppercase. And this modifies the case of all the characters within the string. So let's take what we've learned here and place it into our application. So we have to find a place real quick to make this case insensitive. We need to do this before we start using the parameter word to count. So I know the first place I use word to count is here on line 15. So I'm going to place it up here. So now that we know how to make this case insensitive, we have to decide, do we want to make our string uppercase or lowercase? And I'm going to choose lowercase just out of personal preference. So what I place here is word to count equal word to count dot to lowercase. What this is going to do is take word to count, set it to its lowercase form, and then reassign word to count. So let's go ahead and run this. As always, it's waiting for our input. I'm going to provide that input. We scroll up. So we see we have no more uppercase letters. Everything is lowercase. Perfect, exactly what we want to see. The final task we have is to exclude non-alphabetical characters. How we're going to do that is that we're going to utilize some of the class methods from the character class. So we need to check to see if a character is in fact a letter. That's when we use those character class methods. The one specifically we're going to use is the isLetter method. How we access that is through the character class, so character.isLetter. Then we provide it with a character to check, in this case, the capital T, which will return true. Another example is that we provide the character for. This will return false. So let's use this now in our application. So where do we do that? Where do we exclude non-alphabetic characters? We can only do that when we're looking at the character individually. unlike setting our string to lowercase, which we could do at the string form, we have to look at each character individually and determine if it's alphabetic or non-alphabetic. So when we're looking at characters individually, we would be in the for loop when we're looping through that array of characters. So I'm going to place it here. Let's create an if statement because we need to make a decision whether or not it is a letter. So now knowing we need to use that character is letter method, we call out the character class. We say .is letter, and now we need to provide a character for it to check. So I'm going to provide the index of array of characters that we're at to check if it's a letter. What we really need to do is that if it's not a letter, if is letter equals false, then we need to exclude it. How we can exclude it is just simply jump back up to the for loop and say, hey, just ignore this index because it is not a number. And how we do that is we use the keyword continue. Continue tells the for loop at this moment, stop what you're doing and go back to the top and continue on. So let's go ahead and try this. As always, we paste in our input, we scroll back up. Perfect. Exactly what we want to see. All right, on to the super bonus. What we have to do here is to read a string in from a file. This is fairly challenging, and it might have taken some extra research to find out how to do this. So what we're going to do is create a text file, aka a .txt file, for our application to read in from. So right-clicking on the project, we say New, File. I'm going to call it example.txt, which means text file. In here, I'm going to place that input we've always been using from our assignment. And now that we have a file to read from, let's allow our application to do so. We come over to character counter class. And again, this is a different task. So I'm going to create a new method to read in text from a file. It's going to return a string, aka the text from the file. I'm going to call it get text from file. And what it's going to need is a parameter, which is the path to the file. What we need to do is that we need to create a string to store all of the content that we're going to find in this file. We've done this before. We're just going to create a string variable. We'll call it content, and we'll set it to an empty string. Next, reading from files can be slightly dangerous. The file could be corrupted. The file could not exist. The file could not be the correct format that we need to read from, and so on. If we know there might be a lot of problems when doing something, we need to protect ourselves. To do that, we use the try catch to try something, and if something fails, we have that catch block to save us. So I'm going to put in a try catch here, and I'm going to place exception into here. If anything does go wrong, we need to print out the stack trace. What the stack trace is just showing us where that error actually happened or what exactly happened when everything blew up. Now this is ready, let's read from the file. We need to store everything that we read from the file into a variable, which we already said is going to be content. We say content equals new string, and then string's going to take in a parameter. We're going to use a new class called files, F-I-L-E-S, and then a method called readAllBytes. This method takes in a parameter, which is a path for the file method to read from. So what we do is we use another class called paths, and then we get the path using a string of a path provided, which we know to be our parameter, path to the file. We're going to import the paths class, and there we go. This is how we read in from a file. Finally, we said we were going to return a string, so that's what we need to do. Return our content string. Perfect. Let's go to our main and test it. We no longer need to ask the user for the input. We're going to grab it from a file. So we say string my user's input equal my character count dot get text from file. We called it example.txt. So let's go ahead and run this. And now we see that we're getting back the exact same output, but this is from the file because that's what we're getting our user's input from. So now we know that it's working properly. And there we go, we've completed the super bonus. Fantastic, we have reached the complete end of this studio. We have completed the bonus missions and the super bonus missions. Awesome job following through to the end. If you have any questions, always feel free to reach out.